G'day ladies and gentlemen, welcome to Draw with Jazza. I'm Jazza and this video is a tutorial on how to draw the female body. There are a few reasons I'm creating this video and one of them is not because I consider myself an expert on the subject. So I just want to get that out of the way from the beginning. I have experience of lots of different things and to be completely honest with you, drawing females and the female physique is actually one of my weaker points. I think it's worth sharing my perspective and the things that I've learned to help make me a bit more confident and the things I keep in mind when drawing women. Another reason I'm making this video is because I actually made a video on this very theme on how to draw the female body about 4 years ago. It's really time for an update. Another little quick disclaimer, this video is on drawing cliche comic book type style bodies, an illustrated style. It's not really about perfect realism, it's actually about accentuating femininity through cliche female figures. If you want to delve into more things like different body types, there's a video I did on how to draw different body types that I'll link to on the screen and in the description. And if you find that sort of thing interesting, go check that out. And of course, if you enjoy the content of this video and you want to dive deeper into the subject, there is a free reference file, which is what I'm working in here. So if you want to play with the layers in Photoshop and have a closer look, the link is in the description. And of course, if you're interested in the way I teach this sort of subject, go check out my ebook and photo reference pack. You can get them in a bundle, but the ebook is called Easy Anatomy and the photo reference pack contains hundreds of images of the male and female models in different poses. So hopefully you'll find those useful, but that aside, let's jump into today's video. And the first thing I want to talk about is construction. When I draw figures, when most artists and animators and illustrators draw figures, cartoons or realistic or whatever, it's always best to start with a simple foundation. And sometimes it can feel daunting or complicated when you look at someone's final artwork and you admire their art and you want to draw like that and you don't see where it's come from, you just see the final piece. But most of the art you'll see has a bit of a history that looks a little something like this, basically where you have steps that when you take it backwards, begin with a very raw sort of aesthetic. So when using this deconstructed method moving forward, this is usually the way I like to go about it. I start off with the core, more solid shapes that are part of the skeleton, like the rib cage and the hips or the pelvis. Then I use simple lines and shapes, adding things like limbs if they're in a particularly tricky pose, and then slowly adding the silhouette or the meat onto those bones, so to speak. And then slowly but surely we refine our silhouette until we have the final shapes that we're working with. And we go through that construction process usually with a pencil so you can erase it later, or if you're working digitally, I usually have a construction layer and then I have final artwork on top. The next thing I want to talk about is the process of identifying the features of the female form that are most notable that you can use as a bit of a foundation and things to think of when you're drawing females in your animations and illustrations. So in this visual example, you can see the blue lines are my construction lines, and then there's some grey lead or pencil lines on top that are the final and refined details. But the blue lines and the construction lines show the shapes of the skeleton that I roughed out first and slowly used to build up the silhouette. Later in this video, I'm going to build some poses from scratch using the construction skeleton method and then adding upon that. But before we jump into that, I want to take some time to outline these key features that I alluded to before. One of the first notable differences between a male torso and a female torso is this shape in the inside that is often referred to as the hourglass figure. This hourglass figure is the result of the top half of the female torso having boobs and the bottom half of the female torso having hips, which are childbearing that male hips aren't. Now, I will pause right there and just to let anyone know who might have been caught off guard with the fact that I said the word boobs, that's probably going to come up again. In this video, we're talking about the figure, and the fact is, one of the reasons I didn't draw women when I was growing and developing as an artist is because I was shy and I found all that stuff a little bit like naughty, I guess. I grew up in a religious household and I felt like I was not supposed to look at the female figure because that's too close to looking at porn. And I think as a result, I suffered as an artist because I didn't take the time to learn and practice something because it made me uncomfortable at the time. So we're just gonna throw all discomfort out the window. We're gonna say words like boobs, and moving forward, let's just relax and enjoy the process of learning new artistic tools and techniques. And if you are so inclined to enjoy the visual aesthetic of boobs, then hopefully you'll get something out of that too. So as I was saying, the first most notable feature of the female torso is that we go in at the waist just under the rib cage and then out towards the hips. The second thing that I'm going to mention, which was really useful for me to know, is that it's good to keep in mind to draw the hips, the waist of the female figure, at least as wide as the shoulders, if not slightly wider. This is quite different from a male physique, which often will have shoulders that are quite wide and a V-tapered torso, and this wide shouldered look is a very masculine look typically. And when we're drawing typical comic book style females, we want to use some of these things that are cliches, help us communicate femininity, and these are two tips that I find particularly useful. So the first one being hourglass. The second tip we mention is the hip to shoulder. The third tip I want to talk about is the breast shape. Oftentimes people who are starting off drawing, and drawing women in particular, they'll think, okay, boobs are round, so I'm going to draw a circle and then sort of that will become the boob. And the reality is, while yes, there's curvature and there's a roundness to the breast, I kind of think of them more as two teardrops hanging around the neck. That sounds a little weird to say, but I'm going to show you visually what I'm talking about. I say teardrop because the cliche teardrop shape is something like this, but in reality, it's also a little bit more like a hanging water balloon. And that is sort of the physicality that we're talking about here. There's a weight that's held down and pushed against the bottom of that shape. And when I say hanging around the neck, if you could imagine some sort of a strange neck scarf that has two water balloons hanging from it. If you could imagine wearing that around your neck and these being two water balloons, more or less, that's a better way to think about it than just drawing circles and those becoming boobs. So to sketch out what I'm talking about, imagine we have that string shape and then the water balloon hanging like so. I wouldn't necessarily draw the string shape always, but that water balloon shape tends to help me sometimes when drawing construction because it also helps me remind myself of the physicality and the way that the mass sits on the body, because even in a side-on view we have a similar sort of effect here where the mass sits on the body in a different sort of way. Now of course, when the breast is supported by a bra, as you can see in this scenario, that mass is sort of held up and made to be a little bit more prominent. But on a torso without support, that mass tends to fall down and slightly out to the sides, which is why I talk about it hanging from around the neck, because then there is a little bit of a direction of mass and weight that goes sort of out in this direction, which is also helpful because if or when you're drawing nude females, that also helps you know where to place the nipple, because that's going to be in that center area of the direction of that weight, sort of around there. So just for the sake of comparison, I'm going to get rid of one of these boobs and just draw a circle here and then a circle in the middle. That is often the construction that people might think of when drawing a woman, and as you can tell, that looks much more surgical and plastic surgery breastish than our little more natural breast here. And again, we're talking about construction shapes at the moment. We're not actually talking about the refined or final image, and we'll get to that later, but basically the way that that's going to end up being drawn with the final line work isn't going to show that entire teardrop or water balloon shape. It's going to be a little bit more like that. We're just going to see the edge that overlays and overlaps onto the side. The next point I'm going to mention is the back arch. Once again, we're talking about cliches here because this doesn't apply to everyone, but when accentuating femininity, the reason having a particularly arched back, meaning sort of curved in this direction, pushing inwards like that, the reason that's useful is because that pushes the chest up and the hips out. And this creates visual emphasis on those two areas, the top and the bottom half of the female torso, that are typically considered more feminine in cliche illustration. There is a comic book poster of the Avengers with all of the males in the same pose as Black Widow in the poster, where they all have like these arched backs and they're poking out their chests and sort of twisting around in these strange positions, just taking the mickey out of the fact that that is a cliche comic book pose. But it is a cliche, and it's a cliche for a reason, and it's because they're using it as a tool to over accentuate and hypersexualize the female figure that they're drawing. And while of course I wouldn't recommend using that for every female you ever draw because it's not realistic, at the same time, it's a tool, and it's useful to know how to use these tools and what they might be useful for if you're creating characters that would benefit from using such techniques. I'll get rid of my weird water balloon necklace thing. And let's move on to point number 5, limb shaping. The general idea that I want to get across with number 5 is that the limbs of the females have general shapes that are good to remember, that follow the anatomy of the muscles, but are soft in a way that only alludes to them and doesn't create a bit of a harsh look. So for example, we have the gluteus maximus, aka the booty. And then on the top half of the leg, which I've drawn up on here, we're moving into things like our quads and hamstrings and all the muscles that I'm going to pretend I know the names of, but I'm not going to explain to you right now because we're going to keep it simple. The reason I'm mentioning this is there is a general shape that is easier to remember, which is of the top half of the leg curving down like that, and the bottom half having the butt shape, and then a little bit of a stop there, not immediately drastic, but a bit of a shape change that goes sort of in and then curves out. I'm going to separate this from the visual distractions of the sketch underneath for the moment. The top part of the leg, which is curved over, then we have the butt, and then we have this inwards shape that is sort of like a shorter curve like that before it curves down into the back of the knee. Now this is obviously quite a strong looking leg at the moment because it's quite thick there. But this general shape can be altered and changed to create different aesthetics. So even if you have a thin leg, I could do a smaller butt and just a thinner curve, shallower curve, but the general style is still applicable, and that's useful because once you know the shapes that work well, you can reuse them and apply them to different body types. For the rest of the leg look, you can sometimes allude to a knee, but you don't want it to be over the top because it will start to look a little bit, I don't know, much. I think it's good to keep in mind less is more. You don't want to overdo things, especially when creating a bit of a feminine look. I'm going to bring the front of that leg in just a little bit, and then we have the leg. This curve, as you can see, sort of continues off into the calf, but overall it's a very continuous looking curve cycle. And when we're talking about drawing very feminine legs, another cliche that you'll see a lot, if I move this up for a second, is that often the legs are in heels or standing on tippy toes. Why is that considered feminine? Well, scientifically speaking, when the weight is rested on the tippy toes of the foot, the butt muscles up here tend to tighten, and so do the calf muscles. It also creates an illusion of the leg being longer than it is when we're resting on our tippy toes, and it accentuates those muscles and curves that are considered attractive or feminine in a traditional or cliche sense. So that's why you'll see a lot of comic book characters, even if they're not wearing heels, on tippy toes, or you'll see flying characters or females with those toes stretched out far out rather than sort of straight feet. It is often a tool used to convey femininity. I feel like my shapes here are a little bit harsh. I'm just going to bring them in a bit. But it's all a balancing act. And the reason we start off with construction is it gives us a chance to play with the shape and the general look before we settle on a finished result and we're happy with it. I wouldn't normally draw a leg straight forward like this. I would actually start off with construction for the pelvis, have a line perhaps going out as a bone to a joint for the knee, and then a line going down to a general shape for the foot, and that would then become the full female leg. So it's a similar process for a front-facing leg. So we have our pelvis shape, a line out for the leg, and then a joint for the knee, and then a general foot shape. I'm going to shrink this so I have a little bit more room to work with. And we're keeping similar things in mind, just the general limb shaping. So we have that outward curve. Basically the top of that leg has that outward curve, and then the inside of the leg has that shorter curve that turns into the underside of the knee. But because we're facing frontwards, that's less prominent. That inward curve is sort of less prominent. It's a generally outwards curve. Again, a little bit of disruption of the shape for the knee, but we really want to keep that minimal. We don't want to overdo that. Less is more. Keeping these curves flowing into each other in an attractive and fairly seamless way is a useful tool. And then we move into the foot, which of course, if it's on tippy toes, accentuate that cliche or stereotypical feminine look. So now I'm going to talk about the arms a little bit, but to do this, I'm going to give myself a little bit of room. So don't mind me as I drag this all across. And over here, I'm going to start sketching out some arm anatomy. So I'm going to create two arms here, and I'm going to start off with a male comparison. The reason I'm doing this is because when you see an extreme comparison of the anatomy, you'll be able to see how I've softened it for a female arm. So we start off with the shoulder muscle, which is sort of divided into three parts. We generally draw it as one shape. In the top half of the back of the arm is the tricep muscle, which divides into two, which you can't really see in this side-on view. And then the most recognizable muscle that most people think of when flexing muscles is the bicep in the top half of the front of this arm here. From sort of in between these muscles, we go into the forearm muscle that sort of curves around and into and towards the thumb side of the arm. And then behind the arm, in a similar mirrored fashion, we have a muscle that curves around and in towards the pinky side of the arm. And then from there, we get into the hands. So that's a pretty stereotypical and masculine male arm. Next to it, I'm going to create the same foundation, but with the alterations that I think of when I'm drawing the female arm. And the first is a smaller shoulder, because usually when I draw construction for a male, I have large shoulder circles. For a female, I keep them much smaller because big and broad shoulders tend to look quite masculine. I use the same skeleton underneath. Now again, there are always exceptions to the rule, but in most cases when I draw female arms, I like to allude to the anatomy through the silhouette or the shape of the skin, rather than adding details or lines around the arms, which will make them look more masculine and a little bit more tight and taut. So for example, when drawing the shoulder, I would just slightly have a little line that curves into where the shoulder goes, and rather than having a harsh muscle shape for the tricep, I'll simply have the arm slightly bigger at the top and then keep my curves and lines fairly elegant and flowing into one another like so. Again, we disrupt those smooth curves only very slightly for the elbow there, like we have with the knee, and then the curves continue in a fairly elegant way, and you can see that we've popped out a little bit there to allude to this muscle that's underneath. But in general, those curves tend to keep a fairly organic flow. Now you can see directly comparing this masculine arm next to this more feminine arm that the approach is the same as far as the anatomy underneath and the skeleton underneath, but the way that we draw the details and the lines around that is quite different, and we keep things much softer. Again, I do allude to that tricep even in skinnier arms just because the anatomy is there, so I usually have it pop out just a little bit at the back of the arm and higher up, even if it's really subtle. When I was learning to draw women and starting off, I used to think basically that just having skinny arms made it feminine, but that's really not particularly true. You still want to allude to the anatomy underneath. If anything, it can help accentuate the femininity of something to have more curves, which brings me to point 6 and the final point of our little pre-look at things. Point 6 is curves and to work with curves. So I'm going to zoom back out here and just reposition this a little bit. And when I talk about curves, that's just curves in sort of every sense. The curve of that hourglass figure, the curves of the lines of motion of the body as a whole. For example, this is the line of motion of a standing pose, but we might, rather than have a line of motion completely straight like this for someone standing, have a curve or a line of motion that goes like that. Or as you can see in my initial example, the line of motion that sort of moves in that S sort of shape is much more appealing and feminine than something that has no motion to it. So curves are your friend, particularly when drawing women. Once again, I used to make that mistake of thinking that just having less mass made something more like a girl than a guy. But these 6 points will help you direct that thinking into something a little more practical and a little easier to turn into a feminine drawing. So before we move on, I'm going to quickly grab a little bit more of an obnoxious color and just outline these. So 1, we have hourglass, so I'm going to draw 1 there. 2, we have the hip to shoulder ratio. 3, we have the breast shape. 4, we have the back arch, which is more visible on the side and in the 3/4 view, but still worth keeping in mind even for the front view. 5, we have limb shaping, which essentially talks about wrapping the skin around the muscle and bones in a way that isn't over the top and maintains smooth curves and an elegant feminine look. And then 6, we have curves as a whole. We're going to take these points and move forward and create some sketches. In the construction sketch phase, everything's really loose and relaxed. And in all of these poses, the 2 shapes I begin with are the circle for the rib cage and a circle for the pelvis. From there, I usually start to define the hourglass shape a little bit, and then where the limbs go, and then also rough in those water balloon or teardrop shapes for the breasts, trying to position them in a way that physically makes the most sense. This pose is a bit of a different one in that the back arched in the opposite direction to all the other poses, just to try and demonstrate it in the other direction. But more often than not, especially in dynamic poses with typical and cliche comic book females, the back is arched in that forward-facing direction. In this pose in particular, I come back to it later in this video to make a few touch-ups to the chest because I wasn't fully happy with how it turned out. In this next pose, you'll notice at one point I actually draw a line underneath where the breasts are, and that's because sometimes I use that as a bit of a guide or refinement tool to position the bottom of the breasts to follow the same angle parallel to where the shoulders are. My final pose here has a little bit more of a skinny body type, but still follows the same general features that I talked about, those 6 points earlier on in the video. In the next part of the drawing process, we move on to our refined line work, and the style of drawing and the pace of drawing slows down dramatically and it becomes a lot more clean. And as you can see, the lines are much more intentional. Where the construction lines were quite messy and loose, intentionally so that I could be relaxed and find the silhouettes that work best, in the refined line work stage, I use clean and clear lines to finalize where those silhouettes are going to sit and where the shapes, outlines and anatomy will be. And again, this is a process in which I keep in mind that less is more phrase, because you don't want to over-define anatomy or overcomplicate the visuals. You really want to use what works best and is the strongest visual aspect of your feminine pose in the best possible way. So I'm going to go through these 6 points again, just on top of this to sort of outline how they have been applied to these figures. If you're interested in the textures and the actual drawing tools that I'm using, I have a custom brush set that I use all the time. You can see them anchored here on the left, but they're available from JAZZA'S.com. So if you're interested in my custom Photoshop brushes, I use them for everything. Feel free to go check those out. The link is in the description to the shop. Otherwise, let's go through this. And the first point is that hourglass point, which is pretty prominent in this pose here, particularly the 3/4 angle poses where the body is reasonably upright or the back is somewhat arched. We get this hourglass sort of aesthetic, which again accentuates femininity. You can also see that pretty clearly here. Something that I find particularly helpful as well is in this 3/4 angle, especially when the chest is aimed up and the back is arched, there's always a little bit of the rib cage underneath that breast that sort of disrupts that hourglass shape a little bit. Rather than just going straight out, it goes in first into the bottom of the breast before it goes up, and that's because the rib cage has this shape. It's actually on this angle there, and where the rib cage stops is where that hourglass shape then begins. Next, we have the hip to shoulder ratio, meaning that the width of the shoulders shouldn't really exceed the width of the hips. So usually you want to use that as a bit of a gauge just to make sure that you're at least as wide in the hips as you are in the shoulders. And in many cases, for example here, the hips are much wider and it tends to look much more effective in a feminine look. Here's another example here. We have the width of the shoulders and then the width of the hips. Continuing now to the breast shape, as you can tell, I didn't just use straight circles to be my construction guide in drawing the breasts. In general, I used my teardrop or water balloon shape hanging from the direction of sort of at that bottom of the collarbone here. Now this is just a little trick that I use, and it's not, again, something that's perhaps anatomically very accurate or scientifically anything, but it's a guide that I find really useful. And in all of these different angles, it was the foundation of knowing how to sort of put that together. As you can see, we actually have the top part of the chest is flat and follows along with the torso until that water balloon shape is followed, but it's a bit of an organic transition. We don't go straight from that flat chest into a boob. That's more where we get to that silicone fake augmented breast look. We want to follow this organically and you know, move out in a way that isn't over the top or disruptive. This of course changes when there's physical support like a bra or a corset or something like that, but we're just sort of focusing on the core female figure at the moment. Next we have the back arch. You can see in particular poses where this is more prominent than others. This angle here is actually one I want to fix up a bit because I've drawn the breasts in a way that actually doesn't fit the final pose. This is a mistake I've made. I didn't quite notice it because I drew the torso first before I drew the arms, and so as a result I positioned the breasts before I actually moved the limbs. But one thing to keep in mind, which I'm going to fix up now, is that where the arms move, the breasts do sort of follow and move in that direction somewhat. So because we have arms that are out on this wide angle, this right arm stretching back and the left arm stretching forward, the breasts should be further apart and angled a little bit more in that direction. Another helpful tip to keep in mind is that the angle of the shoulders should also be the angle, or at least close to the angle of the bottom of the breasts. So I'm going to draw that guideline there, and now just simply delete or crop out and delete the breasts and the sketch layer that I have, and I'm going to go back into my sketch pencil. I'm going to use my construction pencil to draw in the rib cage as it is in its raw form without anything on top of that, and then in a loose construction method I'm going to draw in some breasts. The torso is quite side on, so the right breast isn't going to be all the way across here. It's going to be still a little closer to that center area here in a little bit more of a side on view, but it is being pulled a little bit more in the direction of the arm that's going further back. Then there's that tip again of drawing the bottom of the rib cage underneath the breast before we go into our hourglass shape. And it's also nice to keep things fairly soft, but draw a faint line that represents the middle of the core or the abdomen. That can also act as a bit of a center line for the body and be aesthetically quite elegant. Again, there's an arched back in general in some of these places, even if subtly. I intentionally created this pose here to have an arched back in the opposite direction, just because I didn't want all of the poses to be that cliche superheroine, you know, chest out, arched backwards sort of pose. Finally, we have limb shaping. Here's a good example of that, where you can see the outline of the shoulder muscle, a very light lump, I suppose you could say, up where the tricep is. But the anatomy of the arm itself is only really alluded to, and it's all really about creating interconnecting and elegant flowing lines to make that silhouette. Again, here's another example on the arm here. We have the shoulder muscle that sort of comes in. We have a little bit of a heavier weight up the top half of the back of the arm, which is the tricep area, and then the arm tapers in to where the elbow is. And then finally we have curves, and this is probably something I could do a little bit better. I think my shapes are a little bit blocky, and I would like to create a bit more mass and a bit more curvature around my figures. It's something I'm learning and improving on, but in general it's a heck of a lot better than I used to have, and it's something that is definitely worth me keeping in mind, and I recommend you using as a tool when drawing your female figures. So there you go, ladies and gentlemen, that is my tutorial on how to draw the female body. I hope you found it helpful. Once again, it's an update from my old video. This is the the drawing I produced in my 4-year-old How to Draw the Female Body, and I hope you agree that I've made quite some progress, and I really hope that the tips and tricks that I've conveyed to you help those of you who, like me, have gone through times of really struggling to draw something. Just taking some of those tools that will help enhance your abilities or understanding of a form or figure and improve upon that. And that's what art is about, really. It's step by step about improving yourself and your abilities, encouraging each other, helping each other, and I hope that this has helped you. Once again, if you're interested in diving into the depth of human anatomy, male and female, figures, poses, form and function, go check out my ebook, Draw with Jazza Easy Anatomy, which is a bit of an in-depth guide and focus on the human anatomy, muscle structures in particular, how the muscles work with each other, wrap around each other, work on the body, and different techniques for illustrating using human anatomy as the main subject matter. The link to download the reference file for this video is free and in the description. Thank you for watching, ladies and gentlemen, and until next time, I'll see you later. Thanks for watching. Make sure to subscribe to my channel for new content every week. If you want to support my work and get some goodies for yourself, head over to my store for archives, ebooks, digital brushes, video courses, and more. If you enjoyed this video, here's a link to another video you might like from this channel. And if you want even more, make sure to check out all my behind the scenes action on my vlog channel, Daily Jazza. Draw with Jazza is proudly sponsored by Adobe. Join the Creative Cloud today and get loads of incredible creative tools like Photoshop, Animate, Premiere Pro, and other apps for your computer or mobile device. That's it for now. Thanks for joining the arty party, and until next time, I'll see you later.